Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Franz Ferdinand called Always Ascending. So, okay, maybe it wasn't a good idea for the Wombats to release their newest groove-heavy, sleek indie rock record the very same day as Franz Ferdinand doing a very similar sound. Or you know what, at least that was what I was expecting. The truth is that while I was looking forward to this album even more than the one from the Wombats, I also knew that my expectations would have to be even further qualified. Let's face it, it's been 5 years since the last solo Franz Ferdinand album, and while their collaboration with Sparks in 2015 FFS was certainly entertaining, it wasn't quite as tight or as fun as Right Thoughts, Right Words, Right Action. And more even than that, Franz Ferdinand were fighting off the loss of their lead guitarist Nick McCarthy, who was choosing to spend more time with his family. And let's get real, a lot of bands really cannot come back from that. Granted, calling back old 90s member Dino Bardot for guitar and recruiting remix artist Julian Corey could have some real potential, and recruiting electronic musician Philippe Zadar could have some real ideas, but all of it was reflecting on a band focusing less on straightforward indie rock and more maybe on dance or electronic tones. And while my concerns were not that huge, they had Todd Terje work on their last album for God's sakes, it's clear they've got solid taste in electronic music. I will say I was a little bit skeptical, as my favorite Franz Ferdinand record remains You Could Have It So Much Better, and further pivots away from rock could dampen some of that electric energy that I've loved so much. Not quite the same as what happened to the Wombats, but it could be similar in principle. But again, these guys, they're veterans in the scene, they've got a canny eye towards great songwriting, and this was easily one of the most hotly anticipated records of 2018. So, did they stick the landing with Always Ascending? Well, yes and kind of no. Make no mistake, I've given this Franz Ferdinand record a lot of listens, trying to untangle where the hell I ultimately stand on it, especially as it wasn't quite clicking with me nearly as strongly as their first two albums or Right Thoughts, Right Words, Right Action. And ultimately, where I come down on it is while this does quietly turn out to be a pretty great little album, it ultimately does feel a bit transitional, and you do get the impression that not only did Sparks rub off on Franz Ferdinand a fair bit, and I'm not sure that's a good thing, but they're also kind of resetting the board, reconfiguring where they want to take their sound going forward, and I'm not quite sure I'm entirely on board with it, at least not yet. And again, I'll freely admit, right out of the gate, it took me a fair bit to really gravitate to this sound, because while there are songs that are more driven by the guitar melody, like Lazy Boy and Feel the Love Go, that are easy standouts for me right out of the gate, the arrangements here are more diverse in terms of the driving groove or the centerpiece. Sometimes you get the more defined bass groove of Finally, or the sharper yet more brittle low end of Lois Lane that morphs into an entirely different song by the outro, or the pretty stunning bassy disco gloss of Glimpse of Love. But then on the flip side, you get songs that might take more of a oily, quasi-psychedelic grinding synth to flesh out the melody, like on Paper Cages. Even if when it does get a little bit meatier, there's some swagger to that song. I appreciate that. And yeah, like with the Wombats, if you're looking for one uniformly great reason to pick up this project, it would be those grooves, both in the bass guitar and the amazingly sharp percussion work. But frankly, they're on a different level of complexity here compared to the Wombats, especially with any sort of guitar interplay, with the synths playing to a much higher level of gloss and a burnished sheen. And that's before you even get Terry Edwards blasting away on saxophone on Feel the Love Go. Just utterly great there, perfect timing. Now, what surprised me here were the two ballads on this project. First with the Academy Award nailing the balance between the acoustic guitar and the misty, slightly elegant, but also slightly sleazy synth work, and then especially with Slow, Don't Kill Me Slow. Between the vocal overdubs and arrangement, the jangling guitar echoing into the mix, and the funereal presence of that song. But you know what, let's get real. The reason why so much of that works is Alex Kapranos himself. Now, I have always loved this guy in the microphone, but where on previous records his theatricality felt always a little bit hurried and manic, here with the slightly slower tempos and the greater usage of his lower register, the richness in his voice comes through with a palpable presence that lends many of these songs a gravitas you would not expect, which is why I got pretty annoyed when I heard the vocal production top out on the title track and Lois Lane, hitting this flat, staticky edge that didn't flatter the mix or the vocal arrangement at all, and that's just kind of sloppy production. That should not have happened. And you know what, I've got a few other production nitpicks here too. I prefer a little bit more of a quicker tempo overall, and there's a part of me that does prefer the guitar's drive more of the melody, especially when they aren't compressed into mush on the hooks of songs like Huck and Jim, a song that might have one too many whiplash transitions, which is where the Sparks-esque progressive side is definitely leaking through, and again, I'm not quite sure Franz Ferdinand can pull that off quite as well as Sparks can, but I think the larger conversation needs to come back to the songwriting, and as I said the last time I covered Franz Ferdinand about 4.5 years ago, a lot of their work tends to resist analysis. They're certainly clever in a lot of their framing, and the more Alex Kapranos can own his theatricality, the more subtlety that he can bring to bear, but they don't seem to go that deep. And honestly, that's kind of okay, and it plays the band's hidden strengths when the theatrical melodrama can turn up all the little ironies around them and expose a little bit more depth, less embodying the paranoia that lurked beneath the last album, or the pure antipathy coaxed through on FFS, but here a strange sort of defiant optimism that a perpetually cynical band is going to undercut at every turn in favor of staying lodged in middle gear. Hell, the title track referencing the shepherd tone, a superposition of sine waves separated by octaves, it's a solid metaphor on the veneer of ascending, but never really quite getting there. Your ear thinks that you're going up the scales, but you kind of aren't. And the second verse of Paper Cage calls out the punk's futile rebellion there too, but it's also canny enough to show that the cage is indeed made of paper, and could be shattered if the person made the choice to do so. That becomes the more prominent theme beneath tracks like Lois Lane and Lazy Boy, where people, they can choose to be altruistic and good and make their own happiness, and they'll actually find it. While the cynics and the lazy, they're unwilling or actively hostile to take that next step and do something, and thus they stagnate. But Franz Ferdinand are also smart enough to show the lingering appeal of that stagnation. Hell, look at Huck and Jim, on the precipice of making a choice all throughout those verses in the pre-chorus, and even despite the Scottish band going to the United States and telling them about the systems like the NHS in the UK that they could use in the United States, but they're still gonna drink with quintessential American icons and wallow a little bit themselves. They're gonna kind of enjoy it too. And of course, people might project the image of doing something all in some of their lives, but of course some of that could be a veneer all the same. The Academy Award and Glimpse of Love, they're a great example of this, highlighting the photos and videos put out of the movies of our lives, but then it becomes a kind of a recursive loop as much as we watch and rewatch them in the absence of actually living one's life, especially when it all is just a veneer. But you know what, if that veneer brings inspiration to onlookers, could that be enough to make that feedback loop make more? Or when you get to the closing track, Slow Don't Kill Me Slow, you get the reference to a time lapse in the face of incoming death, life flashing before one's eyes and whatnot. And does one really need that experience elongated when it's your action that stripped that love away? Why would you want to go through that slower? Yeah, it's pure melodrama, absolutely, but the framing is just theatrical enough to nail it, and there is subtle elements of drama beneath it, which is also why the desperate seeking to love friends and enemies on Feel the Love Go clicks as well. Sure, it has the profoundly cynical line of, for the things you do are not who you are, which is the thing the cynic has to say when he's not doing anything. So the response to Spread Love on the Hook resonates, despite feeling a tad bit repetitive and lacking in greater detail. Now, granted, the instrumentation is lush enough on that song that I don't care, but there is an unfortunate trait across a lot of this record that the songs can repeat themselves a fair bit, especially finally. It's got some sharp writing overall, but I wish there was a little bit more meat and detail in the actual text beyond the subtext. So as a whole, okay, look, for a lot of listens through this album, I was on the cusp whether or not I could truly call it great, especially in comparison to Franz Ferdinand's incredibly solid discography. And with all that in mind, I'm confident saying it's not really among their best, but it's also not their worst. And the more listens I give this project, the more I am convinced of its value. I personally might prefer a little bit more guitars, and the writing can feel a bit underweight in spots, but great grooves, excellent vocal arrangements, and writing that surprised me the more I dug into it means, yeah, I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Definitely check it out. For Franz Ferdinand pushing well over a decade in this business, I'm thrilled they stuck for this long in the transition, and the landing, they stuck it. I can appreciate that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know, hoping to get this out a little bit earlier, but I was sidelined with all sorts of nonsense and food poisoning. You don't need to go into that. And if you want to buy the record, highly recommend you do. Links in the description below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious where you diehard Franz Ferdinand fans will fall on this record, whether or not you think the loss of Nick McCarthy really crippled them. I ultimately don't think it did. I think the guitar work is overall really good. I just wish the guitars were emphasized a little more, so we'll see where that goes. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process and support this channel, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. I got another top 10 list coming out in, I think, next weekend, probably close to that, so look forward to that coming up soon. Oh, if you want to see that schedule, link to that is in my Instagram, which is down in the description below. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.